There's this a really common scientific view of reality, the one that often paints a picture of a purely physical universe, maybe without any inherent meaning. It can feel a bit, well, bleak sometimes. And you have to wonder, is that the whole story? Or is it maybe leaving some crucial things out? So today, on the deep dive, we're actually going to challenge that dominant view. We're using the sources you provided and really focusing on the amazing insights of Professor Edward Kelly. He's at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies.
Yeah, Professor Kelly's background is pretty incredible. It gives him such a unique perspective on all this. He got his PhD from Harvard back in '71, psycholinguistics and cognitive science, then spent over 15 years deep in parapsychology. And he didn't stop there. He also worked in, cutting-edge neuroscience, lots of EEG and fMRI stuff at UNC. But since 2002, he's gone back full-time to psychical research. He's the lead author on these really significant books, Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and there's another one coming, Consciousness Unbound. So his background is just perfect for tackling these big questions.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, what we want to do is first kind of lay the groundwork, like what exactly is physicalism? Why is it so, pervasive? And then we'll dive headfirst into the really fascinating empirical evidence, the stuff Professor Kelly and others have gathered that seems to, well, profoundly challenge physicalism's core ideas. It really opens up some radically different possibilities about consciousness and reality itself. Okay, so first things first. Let's try and pin this down. Physicalism. At its core, it's this worldview where Professor Kelly says all facts are determined in the end by physical facts alone. Seems simple enough on the surface, right?
It sounds simple, yeah, but the implications are just huge. Kelly breaks down its main tenets. Basically, reality is just little bits of matter flying around in fields of force, all following mathematical laws. That's it. And if that's true, then humans, we're just fantastically complicated biochemical machines. Nothing more. Our consciousness, our mind, free will, those are just illusory byproducts of the brain. Or maybe they belong to what some call folk psychology, not, fundamental reality. And a really critical point. This view means that there's no possibility of any kind of postmortem survival. None. Looked at cosmically, nature then seems utterly without meaning or purpose, just stuff happening.
Wow. Yeah, that is a stark picture. And it's amazing how deeply this view has sunk in. It's not just dominant in, say, psychology and neuroscience. Kelly points out it's even taken possession of the humanities and religious studies, too. He mentions that in some academic groups in those fields, more than half the members identify as physicalists. And they often try to reduce spiritual experience down to just brain processes, maybe even seeing them as, like, abnormal or pathological.
Right. And this isn't just an academic debate. Kelly argues this worldview has real-world consequences, things like relentless consumerism and unbridled commerce, which he connects to major pollution and serious threats to the planet. I mean, if nature's just stuff with no inherent meaning, then maybe exploiting it doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah.
But the huge question hanging over all of this is it actually true? Because despite how dominant it is, physicalism is facing some, well, pretty significant challenges. And this is where it gets really interesting. It really does. Even setting aside Kelly's specific research for a moment, science itself has kind of moved on in some ways. The physics that physicalism was originally built on, that 19th century mechanistic view, well, the rise of quantum theory and relativity has basically eroded most of the foundations of that. It's not just philosophy anymore. It's what physics itself is telling us about matter and energy. It's weirder than we thought. And beyond physics, the philosophy of mind has found it incredibly difficult to fit perfectly ordinary properties of our mental life into a purely physical box. Think about just consciousness itself, or what philosophers call intentionality, how our thoughts and speech can be about things, how we grasp meaning, metaphors even. How do you explain consciousness feeling like a unified whole, experienced subjectively from my point of view? And maybe the toughest nut to crack is what they call qualia, the qualitative feels of consciousness. What it's actually like to taste a lemon or to fall in love. Many philosophers and even some neuroscientists are starting to think a purely physical explanation might just be impossible.
And this leads us right into Professor Kelly's specific area, human psychophysiology, and how it challenges that physicalist idea of mental causation.
Exactly. So the standard physicalist line is, okay, you decide to raise your hand. That decision is just some neuroelectric activity in the brain. So physical event causes physical event. Brain activity causes muscle movement. Physical causes physical. No problem. No. Like things that cannot be done by the unaided brain acting just as a physical machine. And that was precisely the goal of Kelly's big book, Irreducible Mind.
Right, Irreducible Mind. It's this huge 800-page book building on earlier work by F.W.H. Myers back in 1903. And it just gathers this massive amount of evidence that seems to really undermine that physicalist worldview.
It's an incredible compilation. Let's touch on some of the really striking stuff. First, you've got the whole area of psychical research phenomena, things like ESP, extrasensory perception, and PK, psychokinesis, and also evidence that hints at survival after death. Now, the book isn't just about parapsychology, but Kelly makes a strong point. He says that anyone who becomes reasonably familiar with the hundreds of thousands of pages of case studies and the thousands of experimental studies published in refereed journals cannot fail to come away feeling that there is something here that science is going to have to come to grips with sooner or later. It's just too much data to ignore. Okay, then there's this other category. Extreme psychophysical influence. This stuff is, wow, imagine someone under hypnosis is told a cool poker is red hot and their skin develops a blister, but not just any blister one, taking the form of a 5-pointed star. How does the mind tell the body to do that from the inside out, just based on a suggestion?
That's wild.
Or think about people recalling a severe trauma and suddenly these welts, looking very much like rope burns, appear in their wrists. And these aren't just stories, they've been photographed, documented. There's also hypnotic analgesia. Dr. Esdale in India in the 19th century apparently performed well over 1,000 operations using only hypnosis for pain control. Patients just mooned slightly, no general anesthesia.
Unbelievable.
And he mentions older accounts like maternal impressions from the 19th century. The idea was if a pregnant woman witnessed something really ghastly, the shock could supposedly cause the child to be born with a corresponding birth defect. Now, medicine views that differently today, but it points to this historical belief in a profound mind-body connection.
Okay, so that's the mind influencing the body in extreme ways. What else?
Well, another really fascinating area is psychological automatisms and secondary centers of consciousness. Think dissociative identity disorder, or what used to be called multiple personality disorder. What's really striking are cases where, let's say, personality B seems to know a great deal about what's going on in A, but personality A might be only dimly aware or not at all aware of B's existence. There's this weird asymmetry in the consciousness.
Right, like one-way awareness.
Exactly. But it gets even stranger. These different personalities can show actual measurable physical differences. They may require different eyeglass prescriptions or have different patterns of allergies. This isn't just psychological, it's biological, and it's been documented in the biomedical literature.
Different allergies. How is that even possible if it's all just one brain?
Good question. It really challenges the idea that consciousness is just a single, unified output of the brain. It suggests consciousness might be able to, well, split in some way. Theories like analytic idealism, which see mind as fundamental, might offer explanations here.
Okay, what's next? This is compelling stuff.
Maybe one of the most powerful lines of evidence recently involves near-death experiences, or NDEs, especially those happening under extreme physiological conditions. We're talking about NDEs reported during deep general anesthesia and/or cardiac arrest. Now, these are conditions where virtually every neuroscientist today thinks conscious experience is impossible. The brain is essentially offline.
Right. No brain activity should mean no experience.
But some people report having the most intense and transformative experiences of their entire lives during these periods.
So how do we know the experiences happened then and not just before or after?
That's the crucial part, because they report things correctly that happened during that period, things they couldn't possibly know otherwise. This includes not only local happenings, but distant ones that can subsequently be verified. They might describe conversations or events happening outside the operating room, for instance. And you have cases like Ibn Alexander, the neurosurgeon who wrote Proof of Heaven. He had incredibly vivid, complex experiences during an 8-day coma induced by bacterial meningitis. His medical records were extensively reviewed, confirming his cortex was profoundly impaired.
Okay, that's hard to explain to the standard model.
Very hard. And finally, Kelly includes genius and mystical experiences. He notes these are very poorly handled in contemporary psychology. Mystical experiences especially have often been ignored by science, or if they are discussed, they're often denigrated and pathologized, treated as delusions or brain glitches.
Yeah, that seems common.
But Kelly argues they might actually convey glimpses into different pictures of how reality is actually organized. They hint at a deeper, maybe more interconnected reality than our everyday senses perceive.
So these are all truly mind-bending examples across such different areas. Yeah. When you put it all together, what's the alternative picture? Irreducible Mind is painting about the mind and the brain.
Well, the core argument is that mind and brain are, to some degree, functionally independent. They're related, obviously, but not identical. Our normal, everyday consciousness, this view suggests, isn't the whole picture. It's more like an extract or adaptation, a filtered version of a much more comprehensive mind. So the brain isn't producing consciousness from scratch. It's more like it steers conditioning the operations of this larger consciousness, maybe like a radio receiver tuning into a broadcast or a filter shaping what gets through.
A filter or a receiver. That's a very different model.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's closer to the truth, what does that mean practically? How could we, explore these higher capacities you mentioned?
That's a great question. From a practical angle, if our minds are potentially more comprehensive, then we certainly can learn a good deal more about what conditions in the brain permit expression of these higher capacities. And Professor Kelly points to psychedelic research and research on meditation as probably the two most promising areas right now for actually investigating this, for exploring states beyond our usual filtered consciousness.
Okay, exploring those states is one thing. But then there's the really huge task. The much harder task, as Kelly calls it, actually figuring out a whole new worldview if physicalism isn't the answer.
Exactly. That's what the next book, Beyond Physicalism, tackled. They looked at 11 different philosophical systems that try to make sense of all this challenging evidence. They didn't land on one single winner, but they did find a central tendency. Most plausible alternative lean towards some kind of idealistic theory, specifically something called panenthusiasms.
Panenthusiasms, what's that?
It's roughly the idea that the divine or fundamental consciousness isn't totally separate, but is within everything. Kabbalah is given as one example of that kind of system. Professor Kelly personally concludes that when you really look at all the evidence, abandoning physicalism leads you almost inevitably to what's virtually its exact opposite, some kind of idealism or dual aspect monism.
Idealism meaning mind is fundamental, or dual aspect monism. What's that again?
Dual aspect monism is the idea that there's one fundamental stuff in reality, but it has two aspects, a mental aspect and a physical aspect. They aren't separate things, and one doesn't cause the other. They're just two sides of the same coin.
Got it. And that leads to the title of the upcoming book, Consciousness Unbound, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism.
Precisely. It's about freeing our understanding from those purely materialist constraints.
But trying to overturn such a dominant scientific idea, that's a massive undertaking. It raises some really fundamental questions about science itself, doesn't it? Like, what counts as proof?
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lively debate around this with other experts weighing in. For example, some people, like Bernardo Kastrup, argue that physicalism doesn't just fail with these weird phenomena. It fails even to explain ordinary, everyday consciousness properly. Kastrup also makes the point that physicalism itself can become a kind of escaping into abstraction, where we replace lived reality with mathematical descriptions and forget we're doing it.
And what about the need for prediction? That seems key in science.
Right. Don Hoffman, another expert involved in these discussions, makes that crucial point. He argues that to really convince the scientific community, any new worldview has to offer mathematically precise predictions that physicalism can't make. And crucially, it also has to predict everything physicalism already predicts correctly, like, the properties of the electron to 13 decimal places. That's a very high bar.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge.
But then Bernardo counters that physicalism itself is really a metaphysics, a philosophical assumption, not just a predictive scientific theory. He points out that the predictions of, say, quantum field theory are actually metaphysics agnostic. The math works whether you think the underlying reality is mental or material. The equations describe behavior, not necessarily the fundamental nature of the thing behaving.
That's an interesting distinction. What about reproducibility? That's often raised against size research.
Professor Kelly addresses that directly. He argues that reproducibility in sci is actually rather better than you've described, although it often requires sensitivity, like studying any complex, subtle human skill. He mentions things like Ganzfeld experiments and studies on distant mental influence on living systems as having yielded replicable results over many studies.
Okay. And is there any newer empirical data that seems to point away from physicalism?
Yes, actually. The recent psychedelic research is fascinating here. For instance, there was a key psilocybin fMRI study published in PNAS in 2012. It found no increases in activity anywhere in the brain that correlated with the intensity of the participants' huge mystical experiences. None. Instead, the intensity of the experience correlated strongly with the suppression and decoupling of major hubs in the brain's default mode network.
Less brain activity correlated with more intense experience.
Exactly. Which, as Kelly notes, looks the opposite of physical expectation. You'd expect a huge subjective experience to correlate with more brain activity, not less, if the brain is generating it. It fits better with the filter idea. Reducing the filter leads to broader awareness.
That is counterintuitive from a physicalist perspective. So where does the discussion on theory go from there?
Well, there's agreement on the need for progress, for a mathematically precise theory of consciousness, even if the first attempts are precisely wrong, as Federico Fagan is trying to develop. Because mathematical precision allows theories to be rigorously tested, refined, or refuted. That's how science advances.
Like quantum mechanics, with its incredible precision.
Right. Don emphasizes that point math brings clarity and testability. But then there's a counterpoint, often from a more humanist perspective. Is mathematical precision in itself the only goal? Can it sometimes lead you astray? And the bigger question, is science, particularly mathematical science, the only way to know the true or the real? Or might other ways of knowing, like subjective experience or intuition, also offer valid insights, even if they aren't easily mathematized? It's a tension between rigorous scientific method and the potential limitations of that method for understanding consciousness itself.
Okay, let's try and bring this all together one final time. What this deep dive really shows us is, well, it has profound implications for how you might understand yourself and the universe. This whole idea that consciousness could be way more fundamental than we usually think, that our everyday reality might just be a sliver, a filtered extract of a much larger, more comprehensive mind. It's really something to ponder.
Absolutely. The evidence we've touched on from all these different fields, psychical research, NDEs, psychedelics, even psychophysiology, it really does challenge what Professor Kelly calls the tyranny of materialism. It strongly suggests a different picture, maybe a less bleak one, with more potential, more mystery baked into nature and into us.
So think about this. If your everyday awareness is just a filtered version of something deeper, something more comprehensive, what does that really mean for your own experience? What kinds of hidden potentials might we all have? And how could exploring that change things for us individually and maybe even collectively? It definitely gives you a lot to think about. We really encourage you to check out Professor Kelly's books, Irreducible Mind, Beyond Physicalism, and the research we've talked about today if this has sparked your interest.